Hello and welcome to Political Conflicts with Will. Today I shall be discussing the Siege of Budapest. So to give some background, in 1944 the Soviet army began an operation to seize the city of Budapest, the capital of Nazi Germany's last remaining ally, Hungary. So this is a somewhat forgotten siege of the Second World War and would last 52 days, involving some of the heaviest urban fighting seen throughout the conflict. Thousands from both sides would die in the fighting to take the city, and it would also take a horrific toll upon the civilian population. So before I discuss the siege itself, it's important to understand the alliance between both Hungary and Nazi Germany. This is just to give some wider context as to why the siege began. So in 1938, after Germany's annexation of Austria, both it and Hungary shared a border. And while the two nations would remain allies throughout the Second World War, it was a tenuous alliance. The German leader, Adolf Hitler, mistrusted the Hungarians after they refused to allow his forces to cross their borders and land. This was when he invaded Poland in 1939, and due to its close historical ties with Poland, thousands of Polish soldiers were accommodated in Hungary, and were then allowed to relocate to Allied powers such as Great Britain, which included the Polish pilots. Hitler was suspicious of Hungary to the point where he would only supply them with German arms as late as 1942. Now, given this mistrust, why then did Hungary decide to ally with Hitler's Germany? To answer that question, I want to first look up the Treaty of Trianon, which was signed after the end of World War I. This broke Hungary up, as it was forced to concede over 70% of its territory to states such as Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Romania, which left large numbers of ethnic Hungarians present inside other nations. This meant that much of Hungary's reason to join Germany came out of a desire to return these lands under its control. I'm not going to cover Hitler's Yugoslav campaign, which took place in April 1942, since that's a topic outside the scope of this video. But the long and short of it is that Hungary joined Germany with its sights set on the area in that region which it had lost after the end of World War I. Hungary then annexed these lands, namely the region of Delvidek, or the southern lands, after the German invasion. This Hungarian intervention happened after considerable German and Italian pressure placed upon it to join the war. This pressure proved to be irresistible. The invasion also resulted in the suicide of the Hungarian Prime Minister Paul Teleki, since he had actually signed a treaty of non-aggression with Yugoslavia in 1940. This meant that Hungary's decision to join was ultimately a decision made by Nicholas Horthy, the Hungarian regent, and the Hungarian army. Hungary also benefited territorially after Hitler returned even more lost land after he annexed Austria in 1938. Hitler also oversaw the succession of northern Transylvania from Romania to Hungary during the Second Vienna Award, thereby returning Hungary even more territory lost after World War I, a sort of attempt to settle a long-running territorial dispute between the two nations. After an alleged Soviet bombing of the Hungarian city of Kassa on the 26th of June 1941, Hungary joined Hitler's invasion of the USSR, this being Operation Barbarossa. Although the Soviet Union at the time denied this attack, and the circumstances behind it remain unclear, at this point Hungary was under increased financial pressure from Germany, since Germany had managed to gain a 16% share of the Credit Bank of Budapest, this being the most important commercial bank in Hungary at the time. Nicholas Horthy also appointed the strongly pro-German Laszlo Bardossi to replace Teleki as Prime Minister. Bardossi believed that it was inevitable that Germany would win the war, and sought to protect Hungarian independence by appeasing Hitler. Now, as part of this German-Hungarian alliance, the Prime Minister declared war on the United States in December 1941, after it had joined forces with Britain against Hitler. So it was at this point that there was an increased anti-Semitism within Hungary, which aligned with Hitler's Nazi ideology. Policies such as banning Jews from marrying non-Jews were introduced. Although Budapest was still considered a relative safe haven for Jewish refugees at the time, who were fleeing from the Nazi-occupied zones. This was because, despite the anti-Semitism, the Jews were still relatively safe in Budapest at that time. The Barbarossa campaign went badly for the Hungarians. Throughout the campaign, its army lost most of its tanks and suffered heavy defeats to the Soviet Red Army, namely along the Don River, in which the Hungarians suffered between 100,000 to 120,000 casualties. Hungary's disastrous campaign in the Soviet Union led it to seek peace terms with the Allies as early as 1942. Badossi was dismissed by Horthy after it became clear to him that the Axis would not win the war. Hungary's leaders were also ideologically opposed to the communist government of the USSR, so were therefore favouring the Western powers like the US and Great Britain. At this stage, there were some in Hungary who even favoured occupation by the Western aligned troops, so as to avoid being overrun by the Soviets. It's worth noting that between 1942 to 1943, the tide had shifted decisively in favour of the USSR on the Eastern Front of World War II. Despite early victories in the Barbarossa campaign, in which the German-led force seemed practically unstoppable, Hitler's armies had suffered decisive defeats in and around the city of Stalingrad, as well as Kursk. The Soviet forces would advance for the remainder of the war, reclaiming all the territories lost during the opening stages of the conflict and striking deep into the territories of the Axis powers. Now, Hitler became aware of Hungary's intentions, and Hungary was then fully occupied by the German troops in March 1944. Horthy was allowed to stay on as regent, but only on the condition that a strongly pro-German government be appointed. Hungary became the last remaining German ally of World War II, if you'd even want to call it that at that stage, since its neighbour and fellow Axis power Romania had switched sides on August 1944. This was after being soundly defeated by the Soviet forces. Horthy attempted to negotiate a ceasefire with the USSR, who were now encroaching on Hungarian territory, despite the presence of German troops, but ultimately failed in his attempts to do so. This was because within the Hungarian military, many of the officers were pro-German, so ultimately decided to disobey Horthy's orders to rise up against Hitler's forces. The Soviet Union halted their drive towards Budapest in light of Horthy's negotiations, hoping Hungary would switch sides as the Romanians had done. But after the occupying Germans deposed Horthy and replaced him with a more strongly pro-German Ferenc Szalasi, the Soviets no longer had a clear, undefended, open road to Budapest. Around this time, conditions for Hungary's Jewish population had worsened. Szalasi's far-right and deeply anti-Semitic Arrow Cross Party murdered hundreds of Jews in Budapest, and then dumped their bodies into the Danube. In October 1944, the Jewish population in the capital was forced into an enclosed area, a ghetto, that only covered 0.1 square miles. It's around 70,000 people, by the end of July 1944. Budapest was the only place in Hungary that still had a Jewish community. This is because, throughout 1944, mass deportations of Jews across the country had taken place, which were enacted by the pro-German governments appointed by Horthy. In collaboration with the Nazi Party official Adolf Eichmann, 440,000 Jews were forcibly deported to concentration camps, most being sent to Auschwitz, where 320,000 were murdered in gas chambers, the rest being used as forced labour. On November the 8th, 1944, On the orders of the Arrow-Cross Party, thousands of Jews, still in Budapest, were forcibly marched to concentration camps in southern Germany and northern Austria in order to build defences and fortifications. Many died on these forced marches to cold, hunger, and maltreatment. I want now to discuss the reasons why Budapest was important to the Soviets, and why Hitler was so determined to keep Hungary on side. To understand this, it is important to note that Germany in the late stage of the war was facing acute shortages of oil, which was essential for it to fuel its war machine. This was massively exacerbated by the fact that Germany was fighting a war on two fronts, those being the Soviets in the east and the US-led Allied forces in the west. The Allies had conducted aerial bombing raids on Germany's synthetic oil production facilities in mid-1944, which severely worsened the problem. In addition, Romania had been a key supplier of oil to Germany during the war. With Romania's defection, Hungary became the only source of strategic oil reserve left for Hitler's Germany. Now, Hitler believed that the capture of Budapest by the Soviets would endanger the Trans-Danube region, which supplied the Axis powers with around 90% of its bauxite. This is a material that's vital for the production of aircraft. There was also fear amongst the Germans that the fall of Budapest would give the Red Army a clear pathway to the Austrian capital, Vienna. Now, from the Soviet perspective, the capture of Budapest would gain it access to key bridges over the Danube, a river that divided the city in two, as well as industrial centres within the city. The Soviets, however, overestimated Budapest's importance to German industry and underestimated the vital role Transdanubia played. There was also a political aspect as well. In the aftermath of the German invasion, the leader of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, sought to find ways of securing his western border through the use of Soviet-aligned satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe, a sort of security buffer. The Red Army's victories had indeed secured him a high level of political control in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and, as mentioned, Romania. Stalin was considering the Yalta Conference, which took place on February 1945, which was set up between the Allied powers to discuss and agree upon a settlement for the post-war world, as well as future strategies for the remainder of World War II. Stalin also wished to punish Hungary and the other Axis powers for invading the Soviet Union. This telephone excerpt from the 28th of October 1944, between Stalin and his marshal, Rodin Malinovsky, demonstrates the Soviet leader's determination to seize Budapest as quickly as possible, in light of the Yalta Conference. Stalin: Budapest must be taken as soon as possible. To be more precise, in the next few days. This is essential. Can you do it? Malinovsky: The job can be done within 5 days, when the 4th Guards Mechanized Corps arrives to join the 46th Army. Stalin: The Supreme Command cannot give you 5 days. You must understand that for political reasons, we have to take Budapest as quickly as possible. Malinovsky: If you give me 5 days, I will take Budapest in another 5 days. If we start the offensive right now, the 46th Army, lacking sufficient forces, will not be able to bring it to a speedy conclusion, and will inevitably be bogged down in lengthy battles on the access roads to the Hungarian capital. In other words, it will not be able to take Budapest. Stalin: There is no point in being stubborn. You obviously do not understand the political necessity of an immediate strike against Budapest. Malinovsky: I am fully aware of the political importance of the capture of Budapest, and that is why I am asking for 5 days. Stalin, who has the final word in this conversation, I expressly order you to take Budapest tomorrow. At the time of the recorded telephone conversation between Stalin and himself, Field Marshal Malinovsky and his forces had been fighting non-stop since June of 1944. Nevertheless, at the insistence of Stalin, he was forced to hastily prepare an operation to capture Budapest. Malinovsky commanded the Second Ukrainian Front, which was supported by the Romanian 7th Corps, who were led by General Nicolasova. While present in the battle, the Romanians were ultimately the subordinates of the Soviets. So this was a force of around about 650,000 troops who advanced from Romania across eastern Hungary with the objective of securing Pest, that being the portion of the Hungarian capital located on the east of the Danube River. This operation would later be supported by Field Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front, who managed to liberate the capital of Serbia, Belgrade. Now, Tolbukhin's army group was composed of around 450,000 Red Army troops. The Third Ukrainian Front's primary goal in the battle would be to strike up from the south, to surround Budapest from its western perimeter. Malinovsky had around 564 assault guns and tanks, which would play a more limited role inside Budapest due to their vulnerability inside urban settlements. On top of that, you're talking 11,000 artillery pieces and 3,700 mortars. The Soviets would also have a significant advantage over the Germans in the air, possessing 925 combat aircraft compared to the 350 available to the Axis forces. The Axis forces were outnumbered and outgunned. Former police officer, SS Obergruppenführer Karl Pfeiffer-Wildenbuch commanded the 4th SS Mountain Corps, supported by the Hungarian First Corps, which were led by Colonel General Ivan Hindi. So this was a force of around about 127,000 troops, dotted around the Hungarian capital. Inside Budapest, the defending force was composed of around 70,000 Hungarian and German troops. Arrow-Cross aligned police units, as well as university and other civilian groups, joined the defense of the capital. It was considered dangerous for men over the age of 18 to be walking around the city at this time, since the Nazis would see them as conscripts avoiding mandatory service. Compared to the Soviets, the amount of equipment available to the Axis forces was deeply lopsided as well. 2,800 artillery pieces, 140 assault guns and tanks, as well as 880 mortars. To prepare for the oncoming Soviet assault, the German Colonel General Johannes Friesner had prepared a series of defences known as the Attila lines. These were 3 semicircular concentric lines of defence around Pest, facing eastwards, composed of anti-tank obstacles, minefields, artillery placements, as well as infantry trenches. The construction of these defences started on September 1944 and would not be completed, yet they still proved to be effective at holding up the Soviet advances. Within Budapest proper, a further 6 defensive lines were built east of the Danube, which were completed by the installation of defensive strongpoints. It is important to note that while the Soviets had a tremendous advantage over the Axis in terms of the amount of manpower and equipment, the siege itself would be no easy feat for the Red Army. So, the initial Soviet advance towards Budapest, which started on the 29th of October 1944, covered a remarkable amount of ground. After artillery preparation, the Second Ukrainian Front was able to advance around 70 miles from its initial starting positions within the first week of the attack. However, Hungarian and German resistance slowed the Soviets, and by the 3rd of November, they had failed to breach the Attila line, This therefore meant Malinovsky failed to take Budapest within 5 days. Malinovsky's army group was effectively stuck on the southern and eastern outskirts of Pest. Having lost momentum after the initial assault, German resistance meant Malinovsky was unable to secure Pest throughout the rest of November. It was the view of Friesner that, should the Attila line be broken by the Soviets, Pest should be abandoned, and the defence should continue along the west bank of the Danube. This was due to fears that the Jews present in the ghetto of Pest would riot against the occupying Germans and Arrow Cross aligned police. It was also clear that Friesner lacked sufficient manpower and resources to successfully hold the Attila lines indefinitely. It was on Hitler's insistence that Budapest be defended. He even declared on the 1st of December that Budapest was a fortress and his troops could not abandon the city, even in the event of an encirclement. If the city was encircled by the Soviets, then they were to fight until they ran out of ammunition. All the bridges over the Danube were mined by the Nazis, as were other key buildings around Budapest. In early November, one of the bridges over the Danube collapsed after a detonation during a busy period, killing many civilians crossing the bridge on foot, by tram, or by car. Marshal Tulbukin was able to break through Axis defences between Lake Balaton and Buda, the section of the capital west of the Danube, despite moving at a slower pace to Malinovsky. By the 21st of December, the Third Ukrainian Front was able to secure the Budapest to Vienna highway. This was significant because the highway was a major supply route for the defenders inside the city. The Red Army seized the settlement of Esztergom, located northwest of the capital, and made advancements north of the Ipoli, a tributary to the Danube. This essentially meant that the city of Budapest was completely surrounded by the end of December. The reason why it took the remainder of November, as well as most of December, for the Soviets to fully surround Budapest was a combination of wet conditions, making it hard for the Soviets to advance, as well as urban settlements around the capital, which served as defensive strongpoints, slowing the Red Army's progress. Preventing the Red Army from seizing the city quickly, the surrounding of Budapest caused considerable problems for the Axis defenders. In addition to the Jews inside the city, who suffered terribly under the Arrow Cross Party, Budapest had become awash with Hungarian refugees, fleeing as the Soviets attacked from the east. Furthermore, because the Allies had not subjugated the Hungarian capital to the same aerial bombings that had been inflicted on other Axis-aligned cities, it was seen as a relatively safe haven. It was also not immediately obvious that the Soviets would assault Budapest either. By the end of December and early January, the influx of people was straining the capital's finite resources, and there were inadequate levels of food, medical care, or clean drinking water. Horses, which were used as draft animals, became a major source of food for the starving population during the siege, and many were slaughtered to feed the population. Water supplies were cut off during the siege, which led to poor sanitary conditions. The Danube, as well as melted snow, became the primary sources of water in the city. This became increasingly treacherous throughout the siege, since snipers would position themselves on the banks of the Danube and target those attempting to collect water from the river. For the defenders, the supply situation became critical. On the 25th of December 1944, Hitler ordered the city be supplied from the air. The target was set for 80 tons of food, ammunition, and medical supplies be delivered to the defenders per day through the use of supply drops and direct deliveries by aircraft. This was problematic, however, due to the fact that the Soviets had a greater amount of combat planes than the Germans. The airfield to the west of Buda had been lost as well, which had been used as a key supply hub by the defenders. An 800-yard park on the western slope of Budapest's castle district was the only alternative, but its small side made it impractical for aircraft. Regardless, Pfeiffer welcomed it as a means to supply his troops. The castle district, located west of the Danube, was the main command centre during the siege. It is situated on an elevated point in the city, making it a formidable defence. The defenders also attempted to resupply using barges, which floated along the Danube, which was effective initially. However, this became less and less viable the longer the siege went on, due to the water levels of the river dropping and the level of ice on the river increasing as a result of the harsh winter conditions. By the end of December, Hitler, concerned about the encirclement of Budapest, started to move forces stationed in Poland to help break the siege. The relief force was led by SS Oberfuhrer Hermann Gilly, who commanded the 4th SS Panzer Division, which was situated in the Polish capital of Warsaw. Meanwhile, on the 29th of December, Marshal Malinowski ordered Mikolos Sternemats, a committed Hungarian communist, and Ilya Ostapenenko be sent inside Budapest to negotiate surrender. Concerned about Stalin's impatience, Malinowski hoped that the siege could be ended quickly through talks. The two men were rebuffed by the defenders, and both were killed when their car drove over a landmine. This incident led the Red Army to believe that their enemy could not be negotiated with, and that overwhelming force was the only way to seize Budapest. So Herbert Gilly's 4th Panzer Division attacked from the north as the end of 1944 drew near. The Soviets at this point had two concentric lines that surrounded the Hungarian capital entirely, the Red Army consolidating its gains and advanced into the city. Initially, Gilly was successful, advancing 25 to 30 miles into Soviet-controlled territory. The Soviets were able to halt this advance around 18 miles outside Budapest, and Gilly was forced to pull back, leaving Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch on his own. In late December 1944, with Budapest now surrounded by the Red Army, Karl Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch mused on how to break out the encirclement. One option open was to attempt a breakout to the northwest of the city, so that the defenders could link up with Gilly's Panzer Division, which were moving in from the north. This was problematic due to the heavily forested and mountainous terrain in that direction, which would have led to a slow rate of progress, irrespective of Soviet defense. The second option was to attack in the southwest, where the terrain was less challenging, and would then turn north to meet up with the 4th Panzer SS Division. The major drawback to this plan was the strength of the Soviets present along that route, which presented a formidable challenge despite the easier terrain. Wildenbruch ultimately settled on the latter option, if the Soviets overwhelmed his forces. On the 11th of January 1945, Stalin again pushed for the rapid seizure of Budapest, mindful of the upcoming Yalta Conference. Malinowski, ever wary of Stalin's impatience, utilized artillery, including the Katyusha rocket launchers, as well as airstrikes to soften up the German and Hungarian defences in the Pest district. By the 12th of January 1945, the Soviets and the Romanians had broken through the defensive lines of Pest and were able to advance deep into the district, capturing the Millennium Park. The Pest district was fully taken by the Soviets on the 17th of January 1944, after Malinowski and Sober's forces fought the defenders street to street and house to house. It was around this time Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch requested that he attempt to break out from the besieged city, but Hitler refused his request. For the German leader, Budapest was too important to lose. Despite taking the Pest district, seizing control of Buda would still be a challenging prospect for the Red Army. This was because, unlike the flat terrain seen in the Pest district, the Buda district is comparatively hillier. This meant the Germans had the high ground when facing the Red Army west of the Danube. However, Tolbukin was starting to advance through the Buda district from the west, albeit at a slower pace to Malinovsky, around 4 days behind, roughly. Between the 18th to the 24th of January 1945, Gilly made another attempt to break the siege. The attack started westwards from Lake Balaton to the south of Lake Valence. The initial advance by Gilly was highly successful. Poor weather conditions prevented the Soviets from using reconnaissance planes to spot German movements. On top of that, the Soviets falsely assumed that the Germans would redeploy to the Vistula-Oder region, since they themselves were launching an offensive in that location. As such, the units of the 3rd Ukrainian Front, who were stationed in that area, were caught by complete surprise, and Gilly was able to advance right to the Danube, before pushing north towards the Buda district. They were even able to surround the 133rd Rifle Corps, as well as the 18th Tank Corps on the 19th of January, which had been brought forward to shore up Soviet defences. However, Gilly was deficient in infantry, which prevented him from eliminating the surrounded Red Army forces. So the decision was made to advance north towards Buda without eliminating the pocket. The surrounded Soviet forces were able to break out of their encirclement and advance southwards to friendly lines on the 21st, despite losing half their tanks. Despite the initial success, bad weather limited the number of missions that the outnumbered German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, could carry out. By the 25th of January, the German offensive had slowed, and the Soviets had redistributed their forces between the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts to reinforce their lines. The Germans renewed their offensive on the 26th, despite having limited to no air supports due to the bad weather, but the newly reinforced Red Army counterattacked on the 27th, taking the Axis forces by surprise and halting Gilly's advance. This action led Hitler to call off the relief attempt, and by the 11th of February 1945, much of the territory seized by the Germans during the assault had been recaptured by the Soviets. Despite achieving significant success early on, Herbert Gilly's attempt to break the Siege of Budapest had failed. With Herbert Gilly's offensive successfully repelled, the Soviets began to focus on capturing Buda, thereby fulfilling Stalin's request to capture Budapest in line with the Yalta Conference. By the 10th of February, the Red Army had captured much of Buda, including Gellert Hill, an important vantage point that overlooks the Danube. The capture of Gellert Hill was significant because it put the Soviets within a mile of the Castle district, Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch's headquarters. The Axis powers were also no longer able to supply their troops from the air, since the Soviets had managed to effectively overrun the park that had acted as a makeshift airfield for supply deliveries. With the battle effectively lost, Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch attempted a breakout without Hitler's permission on the 11th of February, considering the plans he had come up with back in December, bearing in mind the Soviet successes in capturing Pest as well as most of Buda. His plan was to break out with his men on foot under the cover of fog and darkness, in waves every 3 hours, beginning at 2100 hours. His troops would then link up with fellow Germans located beyond Soviet lines. Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch's forces had been severely attrited during the fighting, so it was only him and 10,000 troops that attempted the breakout. With the Red Army in control of Gellert Hill, the surviving Axis soldiers were forced to divert northwest, rather than in a southerly direction like Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch had originally planned for in December. At this point, at the start of February 1945, the Red Army exercised tight control over the Hungarian capital, so were well aware of Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch's plan to break out of the encirclement. 3 division commanders were killed in the attempted breakout, while 3 more were captured. Pfeiffer-Wildenbruch was also captured in Buda while trying to escape via the sewer system. Of the 10,000 Axis troops who attempted the breakout, only 785 were able to escape. By the 13th of February 1945, the Red Army was finally able to seize the Hungarian capital, 100 days after Stalin's telephone conversation with Malinovsky. The Siege of Budapest was over. Siege was a hard-fought victory for the Soviet Union, which lost around 100,000 to 160,000 troops. Losses on the Axis side amounted to 70,000. In addition, 110,000 were captured by the Red Army. For many Axis troops, being captured was essentially a death sentence due to the harsh treatment they received from their Soviet captors. The civilian population of Budapest also suffered greatly. Around 40,000 civilians were killed during the 100 days of fighting, and the Hungarian capital was largely destroyed. Around 20,000 Jews were deliberately murdered by the Arrow Cross Party, as the Soviets took control of Budapest. Food shortages in the capital also continued even after the Red Army took the city, even through March and April of 1945. This was because the Soviets did not view feeding the population as a primary concern, and Hungary was forced to give much of its produce to the Red Army. Indeed, looting by the Red Army robbed an already starving population from its remaining food supplies. Many Hungarians perished from hunger even after the siege had ended. While initially seen as liberators, the Hungarian population was forced to endure 50 years of communist rule, right up until the end of the Cold War. The period was marked by an uprising in 1956, in which the people of Budapest tried, but ultimately failed, to stage a rebellion against the Soviet-installed communist regime of Hungary. The Siege of Budapest was also decisive in ending World War II. The siege was fought at roughly the same time as the decisive Battle of the Bulge, which was taking place in the Ardennes. Around a third of Hitler's panzer forces were contained in Hungary, which could have been used to shore up his forces in the West against Britain and the US. Allied victories on both fronts meant Germany could be assaulted from both the East and the West. In addition, after the siege, Hungary ceased to be an effective Axis ally in the war, meaning Germany had to fight on two fronts alone. A month after the siege ended, Hitler made a final assault into Hungary to secure the oil fields and check the Soviet advance. This assault failed, and in May 1945, Hitler committed suicide. The Soviet flag flew over Berlin, and the Allies were victorious. The climax of the siege took place at the end of the Yalta Conference. For Stalin, taking Budapest was a major political victory, since it granted him considerable influence over East and Central Europe. This allowed him to effectively build his security buffer, a collection of Soviet-aligned satellite states, which included Hungary. This was designed to offer the Soviet Union protection against its Western rivals during the Cold War. Although Stalin promised British Prime Minister Churchill and US President Roosevelt that there would be free elections in Hungary as well as other states liberated by the Soviet Union, such as Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, he would ultimately use his political influence to ensure these states became firm communist allies, aligned with his totalitarian regime. This was the start of what would be known as the Warsaw Pact. After the war, Nicholas Horthy, for his part, claimed in his memoirs that he mistrusted Hitler for much of the time that he knew him. Yet he defended his alliance with Nazi Germany, citing the threat of the Soviet Union, the Asiatic barbarians as he called them, as justification for siding with Hitler, never losing his deep hatred of communist ideas. So thank you very much for watching, fellas. If you'd like to hear more, if you like what you heard today, please feel free to click the subscribe button. Thank you very much.